Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing the first commander I ever built, Oloro Ageless Ascetic. I bought the Precon when it came out and immediately added the most oppressive spells I had to it. It was a control deck without a single creature, since the only creature, Oloro, does something from the command zone. After a couple of months of testing and tweaking, I had to buy another Precon because my playgroup literally wouldn't allow me to play it. I'd be arch enemy from the get-go. So I had the deck for about a year before I disassembled it altogether. Being suggested by a viewer, it brought back memories, so I updated it for this episode. So let's see why Oloro was so annoying to play against in 2013 to 2014. If you're a patron of the Commander Tavern, then you've probably already seen why. Oloro is a 4/5 giant soldier for 3 generic, 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black. I'm surprised that he's a giant soldier, since his abilities don't really play off of his creature types. Also, he might have a pretty high casting cost, but he's rarely ever cast from the command zone. That's because his ability works from the command zone. At the beginning of your upkeep, whether he's on the battlefield or in the command zone, you gain 2 life. If he is in play, then you can pay 1 generic whenever you gain 1 life. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you draw a card. That ability is great and all, but I'm going to focus primarily on the life gaining aspect, which works from the command zone. Oloro's life gaining ability triggers from the command zone at the beginning of your upkeep, so that means that right off the bat you're going to gain 2 life during your first turn. Since Oloro is working on his own, you don't even need to cast him. In that regard, he's similar to the commanders that have the Eminence ability. Gaining life from the get-go means that by the time opponents drop a creature and are able to enter combat with it, you're a prime target for attacking, if nothing else than to neutralize your early game advantage. Due to that inevitability, the deck was designed by being as anti-creatures as possible. The most obvious way we get rid of creatures is with board wipes. That's why the deck runs Hallowed Burial, Terminus, and Toxic Deluge. Notice that these wraths bypass Indestructible and Regenerate. Hallowed Burial and Terminus bottom decks creatures, while Toxic Deluge gives them negative toughness. Since the deck gains life, Toxic Deluge isn't an issue. In fact, it was printed for the first time in Oloro's Precon. The deck also runs Merciless Eviction as a way to get rid of creatures by exiling them. However, Merciless Eviction also has other modes which can be used to get rid of other card types as well. Although primarily used to get rid of creatures, if you're facing another control deck and they're farther ahead than you are, you can use this spell to level the playing field by exiling all enchantments. It also takes care of Artifact Matters decks as well as Super Friends decks. On a similar note, the deck also runs Hour of Revelation. In case of emergencies, you can wipe the board not just of creatures but of all non-land permanents as well. Unfortunately, Hour of Revelation can't bypass Indestructible or Regeneration, but at least it has the potential of wiping the entire board. However, in case you don't want to lose your own things but want to wipe the board clear of everything, the deck naturally runs Cyclonic Rift. As a small historical aside, Commander 2013 was released after Theros, so the second Ravnica block was still legal in Standard. Back then, you could get Cyclonic Rift for about $1 at most. It's crazy how that card went from a $1 bill to almost a $20 bill in a span of 6 years. The other ways the deck gets rid of annoying creatures is by preventing them from attacking us. That's why the deck runs Ghostly Prison, Propaganda, Sphere of Safety, Collective Restraint, and Norn's Annex. These are your classic Pillow Fort permanents that tax opponents who want to attack you. Any players running Horde strategies or Saboteur strategies will have to go elsewhere if they want to attack someone. Voltron is a different story since a player might be willing to pay the tax to eliminate you with their commander. That being said, the deck runs Core Haven and Maze of Ith just in case that were to happen. Since the deck runs so many enchantments, Sphere of Safety alone might give a large enough tax that players won't be able to attack you. That being said, players tend to unnecessarily take on challenges. From experience, I've found that whenever a player can't attack their opponent, that's the one they're going to want to try and attack the most. So a player will usually try and get around the tax by destroying your enchantments or just making deals with opponents, etc. In that case, the deck also runs No Mercy. If any creature were to pass through your defenses, they'd die after hitting you, so that'll definitely help opponents think twice before attacking you. In order to discourage them altogether to destroy your defensive cards, the deck runs Karmic Justice. Since all of our permanents are non-creature, if anyone destroyed our Pillow Fort or Stacks cards, we can just destroy their creature anyways. So if anyone disenchants No Mercy in order to attack us with their fatty, we'll destroy their fatty with Karmic Justice. Another way to deal with creatures is to make them worthless with Humility. I remember when Humility came out, so if you're playing with it, make sure you don't do so with Opalescence in play unless you want to delve deep into the 7th layer of Rules Hell. In any case, Humility makes all creatures vanilla 1/1s. Well, all creatures except Oloro, who still works as intended from the command zone. It won't work against commanders with Eminence either, but at least it deals with what's on the board. This means that we can still gain 2 life every upkeep with Oloro, even though Humility is on the battlefield. Another thing I love about Humility is comboing it with Knight of Souls Betrayal, which is also in the deck. These 2 cards on the battlefield together make it so that almost no creatures will exist on the battlefield due to state-based actions. Creatures entering the battlefield with +1/+1 counters are another story, but at least it deals with almost anything. Oh, Humility can't be gotten rid of with something like Reclamation Stage entering the battlefield either. State-based actions are always checked at all times, so when it enters the battlefield, it's instantly a 1/1 without abilities. A creature would only be able to get rid of Humility if it has a trigger when being cast, not when entering the battlefield. Just in case you were to stumble across such a situation in your games, then you know what to do. But I'm not done yet. So far we have ways of wiping the board altogether, impeding attack, and just straight up preventing creatures from existing on the battlefield. That's not all. We still have to punish opponents for when they do cast creatures. Spreading Plague, Overburden, and Tainted Ether are as oppressive as they come. Any player with a mono-colored deck will hate playing against Spreading Plague. Any creature that player has entering the battlefield will pretty much destroy every other creature they have in play. But it's not just that. If any player plays their multicolored commander, then any other creature they have in play that shares their color will be destroyed, which in theory should be all of them, since that's how EDH deck building is in the first place. All your cards have to have the same color identity as your commander. If all else fails and no one's casting any other creatures just to try and get you, you can just cast Oloro in order to destroy all other white, blue, or black creatures. Overburden is another oppressive card since players need to bounce a land to their hand whenever a non-token creature enters their battlefield. This doesn't hurt token strategies, and it might even help landfall strategies, so play this spell accordingly. But it will definitely provide a huge tempo loss for horde decks as well as mid-range decks. Tainted Ether is even worse since it is triggered by tokens. Not only that, but if a player wants to keep the creature that just entered the battlefield, they have to sacrifice another creature or a land. Since having these effects in play gives your opponents time to work around them eventually, the deck does run Leyline of Anticipation in order to be able to flash in any of these cards in response to any pertinent action by an opponent. The Leyline is especially brutal in that it makes all our board wipes be able to be cast at instant speed. Now, I know there's a glaring question. What about similar decks that are heavy control and light on creatures? Well, this deck punishes them too. First off, the deck's running Rhystic Study and the newly included Smothering Tithe. Making opponents pay attacks on their spells slows them down if they don't want to benefit me. Since my deck is control, the slower the game, the better for me. But if they don't pay, they accelerate my game by allowing me card advantage or mana advantage. So either way, me being faster than they are makes them slower by comparison. Other controlling elements of the deck are obviously the counterspells. The deck runs Counterspell, Negate, Swan Song, Mana Drain, Pact of Negation, Force of Negation, and Force of Will. These spells are pretty straightforward as most of them aren't used to counter creature spells. Creatures aren't a weakness to the deck, so being able to counter huge spells or detrimental board wipes really makes a difference. Other protective elements of control include Greater Aromancy. Giving Shroud to our enchantments is key since this deck is almost 25% enchantments. Since Greater Aromancy doesn't give Shroud to itself, the deck runs Copy Enchantment as well as the newly added Mirror Maid and Estrid's Invocation. Having any of these enchantments enter as a copy of Greater Aromancy means that only global effects will get rid of our key strategic pieces. Even then, if someone does wipe our board, the deck runs Replenish, which will just put onto the battlefield all the enchantments we have in our graveyard. I'm also running the newly added Hall of Heliod's Generosity as a way to recover any enchantment that does manage to get destroyed by opponents. The deck's only creature is Clever Impersonator. Although a creature in every other zone, it usually enters the battlefield as a copy of an artifact, enchantment, or planeswalker. Being able to duplicate certain effects makes it worth running every possible copy effect for enchantments in the deck, and this Shapeshifter is no exception. Besides, the creature hate cards have the effect on it since it doesn't necessarily have to enter the battlefield as a creature. It's a creature on the stack. That means that if it enters the battlefield as a copy of Greater Aromancy, it isn't affected by cards like Tainted Ether, Humility, etc. Keep in mind that Telement Performance is a card that exists, so having 0 creatures in your deck does provide a certain liability, especially to niche cards like this one. So if you're unable to counter that particular spell and you don't have Clever Impersonator in your deck, you're essentially toast. But Clever Impersonator is so useful, and for all effects and purposes, it's not treated as a creature in the deck, similarly to Oloro basically being an emblem you start the game with. Another non-enchantment copy effect is found on Mirage Mirror. What I love about Mirage Mirror is that it only lasts until end of turn. That means that for 2 generic mana, I can change it into whatever I need at instant speed, and it isn't permanent. Unfortunately, once it does, it loses that copy ability until end of turn, so keep that in mind when you use it. The rest of the control aspects are found on Planeswalkers, so let's evaluate them one at a time. Ashok Dream Render prevents opponents from looking through their decks for anything, much less tutor for answers against our things. If your playgroup is keen on playing fetch lands or ramping effects, this is pretty oppressive early game spell. Its -1 ability is a bonus since it's only really needed when facing graveyard strategies. Dovin Hand of Control is another taxing effect. Dovin helps slows down other non-creature based decks. It also really hurts Storm decks and Artifact Matters decks such as Urza and Emery. His -1 ability isn't irrelevant either, since it can at least deal with an opponent's threat until you're able to draw into something more reliable to do so. Narset Parter of Veils prevents opponents from drawing more than 1 card per turn. She might nombo with Smothering Tithe, but as a control player, you definitely don't want the rest of the table digging through their decks to find answers, even less so if they're ganging up against you. Her -2 also helps in a pinch, since it can help you dig through your deck a bit at least twice before she's unable to continue doing so. Having 62 spells in the deck that aren't creature is helpful as well. Teferi Time Raveler really slows down opponents by forcing them to cast spells only when they can cast a sorcery, so they're only limited to their main phase when the stack is empty. This is very harrowing against control players since they won't be able to counter any of our spells as well as cast things outside their turn in order to keep mana open. His +1 is a conditional flash effect for our sorceries, which is amazing since it allows us to keep mana open for counter spells without worrying about not being able to cast our board wipes. This means that we can cast Toxic Deluge in response to an Alpha Strike or at the beginning of the end step before our turn. His -3 is not only used to bounce an opponent's card and give them a loss in tempo, but we can also gain a card from it. However, we can also use it to bounce our own enchantments, especially if we want to reuse our copy enchantments into something else. Narset Transcendent is a great pseudo draw since 62 cards are non-land, non-creatures. Her -2 is not used as often, but is still great when combined with a board wipe in order to prevent opponents from casting anything during their next turn due to the fear of the rebound. Her emblem is crazy oppressive since it outright prevents opponents from casting any non-creature spells. The deck already has so many ways to get rid of creatures, this essentially renders most decks useless. Tamiyo the Moon Sage is a bit overcosted, but her +1 can continuously freeze down any permanent. That means it's not just limited to a Fatty or Voltron commander. It can also be used to tap down a Gaia's Cradle, Cabal Coffers, etc. Her -2 isn't used too often if we're keeping the board clear of creatures, but her emblem is also incredibly busted in this deck. This means that board wipes return to our hand after casting them, as well as mass draw spells and counter spells. Also, any permanents getting destroyed just return to our hand instead. Getting this emblem usually signals the inevitability of the end. Liliana Vest is used to chip away at an opponent's hand, preferably the control player, as well as a means to consistently tutor for anything we need. And what exactly are we tutoring for? Well, any of our win cons, but we'll get to that in a moment. Since the deck does try to keep the amount of creatures in play to a minimum at all times, Planeswalkers aren't in that much danger as far as combat damage is concerned. Even then, the deck is running Cards Bastion just in case as a way to proliferate loyalty counters whenever convenient. Control decks need to be able to not run out of steam, so it's important to be able to protect your board state. The deck might run all necessary cards to do so, but if you don't draw into them, then it's as if you don't have them. This is why the deck runs Sphinx's Revelation, Stroke of Genius, and Blue Sun's Zenith. Besides these spells that can be cast at the end of the turn before yours, and great mana sinks as well, the deck also runs Phyrexian Arena. Since Oloro gives us 2 life each upkeep, we're still on the positive side of things when the arena's trigger resolves. However, Phyrexian Arena isn't the best enchantment with which to invest our life as a resource. That honor goes to Necropotence. You know that a deck like this has to run Necropotence. Even though it costs triple black, it shouldn't be a problem with all the mana fixing the deck has, which I'll soon discuss near the end of the video. Being able to empty your life into it in order to sculpt the perfect hand spells almost certain doom to your opponents. Either way, you don't have to lose all your spoils since the deck does run Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel. In order to be able to cast as many of these enchantments and spells in a single turn as possible, the deck is running plenty of mana rocks for mana acceleration as well as lands like Cabal Coffers, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, and Serra's Sanctum. Combined with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, the coffers give a ton of mana. With so many permanents, Nykthos will almost always provide some net gain in mana. If not, it can still tap down for colorless mana. Serra's Sanctum can generate a ton of white mana since the deck is 24% enchantments. I'm also running Thespian Stage as a way to copy Cabal Coffers or any other utility land or mass mana land in play. In addition to this, the deck is running Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Azoria Signet, Orzhov Signet, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, Soul Ring, Mana Vault, and Mana Crypt. The great thing about Oloro is that Mana Vault or Mana Crypt harm us during our upkeep. He neutralizes that damage with a life gain. Again, as I've mentioned before, you don't need to run the more expensive mana rocks I've included. You can just as easily swap them out for rocks like Felraw Stone and the 3 talisman that lie within Oloro's color identity. On the topic of good things happening during our upkeep, the deck also runs Paradox Haze in order to double our upkeeps. This means twice the life with Oloro and twice the draw with Phyrexian Arena. Paradox Haze can also be copied with the previously mentioned copy enchantments for even more upkeep hijinxes. Alright, so now that I've gone through every facet of the deck, from controlling to destroying to oppressing to accelerating to recovering, how does it win? I've mentioned generating a lot of mana as well as mana sinks, particularly to spells like Sphinx's Revelation and the like. But the other mana sinks in the deck are Exsanguinate and Death to the Deathless. Spending enough mana in these can take out the entire board at once, especially the latter. During a match, some opponents may attack each other being as they aren't able to attack you via the pillow forts. So it's not necessarily going to come to a point where you have to invest 40 into X in order to clear off the table. These are also just good if you need to bounce back from the brink of death with the bonus of maybe doing it at the cost of an opponent dying. The other win cons are more viable, one being Test of Endurance. Since we start the game at 40 life, realistically it's 42 life since we gain 2 life before even drawing our first card. This means that getting this out as early as possible and protecting it means that we win fairly quickly. Even then, if we manage to find it mid to late game, we should be at more than enough life to win with it in the next turn. Keep in mind that the best way to win with this is if you have greater Aromancy in play with something having copied it. You can also flash Test of Endurance before your upkeep. If you do it at the beginning of your upkeep step, then you miss the game-winning trigger, so keep that in mind as well with timing. With Leyline of Anticipation. Having a bunch of counterspells is also a good way to protect it from spot removal and mass removal effects. The final win con of the deck is another Oops I Win combo since it involves an inescapable loop. Once this loop starts, it won't end until all players are killed. Yes, it can be interacted with just like anything else, but once it begins, it's out of your control. And that's the classic Exquisite Blood, Sanguine Bond combo. The way this works is that once an opponent loses life, Exquisite Blood triggers and you gain that much life. But once you gain life, Sanguine Bond triggers and opponents lose that much life. Then the loop happens until an opponent loses. Keep in mind that it can also begin the other way around. So this combo can begin once an opponent loses life or once you gain life. Again, these enchantments can be protected, so do your best as they will win you the match on the spot. However, if an opponent has Platinum Angel in play, the game is a draw since the loop will continue on for eternity. This also happens if an opponent casts Angel's Grace in response. Thus, the game would have to be considered a tie. The rest of the deck are just the lands. I'm running all 10 fetch lands, all 3 dual lands, all 3 shock lands, Jomar's Cavern, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Reflecting Pool, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, and Ancient Tomb. The deck's also running 1 of each basic snow land in case anyone plays anything that benefits us to do so. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Oloro Ageless Ascetic. This creatureless build was just a self-imposed restriction that you don't have to follow. The reason I build it this way is because of all the creature hate the deck is packing, so sometimes you'd draw a creature and not be able to use it due to your own control of the board. Also, keep in mind that most players' favorite strategies revolve around creatures, so preventing them from playing or keeping them around may produce a lot of salt. So stick to the social contract before playing this commander. Trust me, I know from experience. That being said, this deck is a lot of fun to pilot and play with. So if you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.